Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading the final section of Unburdened by Conscience by Anthony W. Neal. Remembering the pain, remembering the hurt, remembering the things that we've actually gone through as a collective people. He thought that he was writing for a post racial world because Barack Obama had been elected president, and he didn't see that we would have white backlash like we always have white backlash to Black progress. He didn't have the foresight to know and understand that America is not ready to deal with its racist history and its racist present. It's going to go back to the racism like a dog going back to its vomit each and every time. It starts on page 129. I'll be right back.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
100 More Years of Racism and Cruelty is the title of chapter 19. It starts with a quote by Joshua Henry Jones Jr. They've lynched a man in Dixie. Oh God, behold the crime. And midst the mad mob's howling, how sweet the church bells chime. They've lynched a man in Dixie. You say this cannot be? See where his lead-torn body mutely hangs from yonder tree. Excerpt from They've Lynched a Man in Dixie, The Heart of the World, 1919. It's interesting that that was written during the Red Summer when we were rioting all the time. Scholars debate whether or not permanent psychological scars were inflicted upon Black people by American slavery. Did they emerge from its brutality relatively unscathed? As mentioned previously, the historian Stanley Elkins argued that the heritage of American slavery crippled Black people. He charged it responsible for the psychological, social, economic, and political condition of Blacks in the 1950s. Even today, a Black psychologist and 2 Black licensed clinical social workers have coined the phrase post-traumatic slave disorder. They contend that current dysfunctional behaviors and disorders that exist among Black people have origins linked to American slavery, and they suggest that there is an intergenerational transmission of the slave trauma. Their argument, however, does not have the ring of truth, primarily because American slavery was legally abolished over 145 years ago. I wonder why he brings that up, because we didn't just have slavery that ended 145 years ago. We had to live through Jim Crow segregation and the Civil Rights Movement. But anyway, another more rational explanation exists for rejecting the contention that the heritage of American slavery psychologically crippled people, Black people. Any discussion of American slavery and its lasting effect, if any, on African Americans today must consider that neither President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, nor the 13th and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution abated the coercive, psychological, social, economic, and political manifestations of racism practiced by whites. The ideology of white supremacy, which underpinned the American slavery regime, did not die with American slavery. It survived, and it survives well into the 21st century. Black people emerged from the horrors of slavery only to face postbellum and 20th century forms of racism and savagery. Indeed, the 100 years immediately following the period of American slavery was a brutal and fearful period for Black people. After the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan and Southern and border state police forces replaced the slave patrols in terrorizing Southern Blacks and maintaining the social order. Mindful that Black men were no longer their valuable personal property, Southern whites began murdering them at an alarming rate. And I will add here, they murdered the storekeepers. They murdered the businessmen. They didn't just murder everyday field hands all the time. They were murdering our best and our brightest. While white Southerners' guns remained, his rope, his match, and his gasoline replaced his bullwhip as his favorite implements of death. The historian Robert A. Gibson wrote, "In the last decades of the 19th century, the lynching of Black people in the Southern and border states became an institutional method by which whites used to terrorize Blacks and maintain white supremacy. Generally defined as a public and spontaneous extrajudicial killing by mob action, lynching was the violent means by which the white Southerners maintained control over Black Southerners. Although most killings consisted of hangings and shootings, more ghastly forms included maiming and dismemberment, castration, and burning at the stake. From the last 2 decades in the 19th century through the first half of the 20th century, it is estimated that from 2,800 to nearly 5,000 murders by lynching occurred in America. Black people constituted roughly 73% of the victims. 90% of all lynching occurred in the southern states, but the remaining 10%, of the remaining 10%, 1/3 took place in states bordering the South. The state of Mississippi led the nation with the highest incidence of lynching, closely followed by the states of Georgia and Texas. In 1892, the number of killings by lynching reached its peak. That year, an estimated 161 blacks and 69 whites were lynched. While the turn of the century marked a gradual decline in the number of murders by lynching, the number of deaths accompanied by fiendish methods of torture, such as dismemberment of fingers and ears, the boring of corkscrews in the flesh, and the burning alive of bodies became increasingly frequent. Public indifference to the unbelievable torture grew as well. Consequently, the federal government relinquished its constitutional responsibility to protect the lives of Southern Blacks when neither Congress nor the executive branch of the United States government took action to prevent lynching. To this very day, they're not doing anything about lynching. State perpetrators, even when those officials had advance notice of the lynching event, looked the other way and refused to prosecute the perpetrators. During the post-Reconstruction period, the imagery of Black men raping white women in the South arose as a purely political invention, a pretext for terrorizing Southern Blacks. Antebellum era Southern whites generally did not label Black bondsmen rapists, and we know that throughout the Civil War, when thousands of Southern white men were away fighting the Union over the issue of whether or not slavery in the South could spread to other territories annexed by the United States, not one Black man in the South was charged with raping a white woman. But as a justification for the practice of lynching, post-Reconstruction era white Southerners assuredly offered the popular racist myth that Black men harbored uncontrollable, animal-like impulses to rape white women and their daughters. In one instance, in a speech delivered to the Georgia Agricultural Society at its annual meeting on August 11th of 1897, Rebecca Latimer Felton, a crusader for white women's rights, may have convinced her audience that Black rapists were the greatest threat facing poor white women. You hear that? Poor white women. If it needs lynching to protect woman's dearest possession from the ravening human beast, Felton declared, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. Ironically, from the years 1882 to 1927, white Southerners lynched an estimated 76 Black women. It is unlikely that those Black women were murdered for raping white women and their daughters. The white Southerner's insistence that his woman's virtue required protection from Black rapists was white racist demagoguery, employed as an excuse to subjugate Black Southerners and dissuade them from pursuing economic self-sufficiency. In fact, Southern whites made allegations of murder and of felonious assault most frequently as their justification for lynching Black people. The journalist and lecturer Ida B. Wells Barnett, who lived from 1862 to 1931, and whose read record we read here, and other Black women were at the forefront of the anti-lynching crusade. For decades, they courageously spoke out against the lynching of law-abiding Black men in her weekly newspaper, Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. Wells Barnett printed the following editorial on May 21st, 1892, condemning the use of the fraudulent rape charge as a pretext for murdering Black men. 8 Negroes lynched since last issue of the Free Speech. One at Little Rock, Arkansas, last Saturday morning, where citizens broke into the penitentiary and got their man. 3 near Anniston, Alabama. 1 near New Orleans. 3 at Clarksville, Georgia. The last 3 for killing a white man, and 5 on the same old racket. The new alarm about raping white women. The same program of hanging, then shooting bullets into the lifeless bodies was carried out to the letter. Nobody in this section of the country believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. If Southern white men are not careful, they will overreach themselves and public sentiment will have a reaction. A conclusion will then be reached. They will be very damaging to the moral repudiation of their women, to the moral reputation of their women. Wells Barnett told Southern white men that they probably already knew, but obviously did not want to hear. Black men did not rape white women. And if it was not rape, then it must have been consensual sex. The brilliant scholar and influential NAACP leader W.E.B. Du Bois, who lived from 1868 until 1963, but also had a very different lineage than Southern Blacks because he was, first of all, born free. And although slavery occurred for his parents, I believe he was a mixed race person. Quite frankly, noted that the interracial sex jealousy and sadism were at the root of widespread mob violence in the South. As a consequence of printing the editorial, Wells Barnett's paper office was ransacked and her property destroyed. Undeterred, she became an exile from Memphis, Tennessee, and continued to give lectures in the United States and England about the evils of lynching. She organized anti-lynching societies as well and published pamphlets documenting the South's disturbing lynching record. In 1904, Mary Church Terrell, who lived from 1863 to 1954, was the founding president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, published an article in the North American Review entitled "Lynching from a Negro's Point of View." In that article, she urged ministers and good Christians to protest against lynching, a rising tide of barbarism which threatens to deluge the whole land. The Emancipation Proclamation and Black advancement during Reconstruction, some real and some merely perceived, helped to remove the stigma of Black servitude and change Southern whites' perception of their own social, economic, and political standing vis-a-vis that of Southern Blacks. Nonetheless, the average white Southerner held on stubbornly to his 3 major stereotypical images of Blacks. One was the menial who knew how to stay in his place. The other was the shiftless, happy-go-lucky buffoon, and what Walter White called the habitual criminal and of unrestrained appetites. From the post-Reconstruction period through the early 20th century, Southern whites attempted to convince the rest of the country that the lynching of Blacks was necessary to deter rape and other criminal activity. The North Carolina ex-slave W.L. Post and other Blacks who lived through the period knew better. Post understood that the white Southerner lynched the Black man who tried to get nervy and to have a little bit for himself. In other words, white Southerners lynched Black people to enforce docility in the Black community, maintain the social order, and discourage Black economic advancement. Stereotypes aside, Southern whites feared not only Black social and economic progress, they feared losing Black labor as well. So, this is something that we often don't talk about. We often don't talk about the fact that they don't just want us to disappear, they want control over us. They want our labor, and they want our labor to be given to them for nothing. The control of exploited Black labor was a major impetus behind the development of modern police forces in Atlanta, Charleston, and New Orleans. Adopted on December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, but one exception was carved out with respect to the imposition of the latter. Involuntary servitude could be imposed in the United States as a punishment on anyone who was duly convicted of a crime. Indeed, through the convict lease system, tens of thousands of Black men and women, perhaps hundreds of thousands, were arrested, convicted of violating anti vagrancy laws or other laws, imprisoned, and then leased out to forced labor camps owned and operated by white Southerners. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "The Negro is not antisocial. He is no natural criminal. Crime of the vicious type outside endeavor to achieve freedom or in revenge for cruelty was rare in the slave South. Since 1876, Negroes have been arrested on the slightest provocation and given long sentences or fines which they were compelled to work out. The resulting peonage of criminals extended into every Southern state and led to the most revolting situation. Hundreds of Southern fortunes have been amassed by the enslavement of criminals, and that goes on to this very day under the prison industrial complex and the school to prison pipeline. The 1994 crime bill enriched white people. Moreover, Jim Crow laws relegated Southern Blacks to performing cheap labor as sharecroppers on land rented from their former captors. White police forces throughout the South were bound to dutifully enforce those laws when they were violated by Blacks. When white mobs attacked Black people, those Blacks received no protection from the police. Some officers stood by, others participated in the attacks. Greetings, John Henry. Sharecropping is slavery with another name. It absolutely is. Convict leasing is slavery under another name. It absolutely is. As Danu Smith explained, Southern white police repression continued throughout the Civil Rights era. During the Civil Rights Movement, the world watched in horror and stood by in shock as white policemen on their horses with clubs and dogs savagely beat, and arrested Blacks for demonstrating against Jim Crow. Throughout the 1960s, when Blacks violently rebelled in many urban areas against oppressive conditions, the police and the National Guard wantonly killed a number of participants and conducted sweeping mass arrests. Police repression is and has been historically a matter of official policy often sanctioned and encouraged at the highest level of our government. If the people committing the offenses on January 6th, 2020, was it 2020? On January 6th, you know the event I'm talking about, had been black, had been mostly black, it would have had a different result. The options, the options made available to the police force would have been different. They would have massacred us if we had done what those white people did on January 6th. During the decade of the 1960s, police killed black men at a rate some 9 to 13 times higher than they killed white men. Since 1968 and 1969, for instance, police officers in the United States killed 1,188 black males and 1,253 white males in population of which about only 10% were black. They killed blacks at a rate that was consistently 9 times as high as that of whites over an 18-year period. Just as black folk during the last decade of the 19th century and early 20th century were angered by, but powerless to stop white Southerners who increasingly lynched their people, today there is perhaps no issue as volatile in the black community as police extrajudicial force use of deadly force. Currently, most police shootings occur at night in urban ghetto areas and involve white patrol officers and male civilians of color between the ages of 19 and 29. So they're attacking the men that would normally be ready to have children. Since law enforcement officers prefer adhering to the blue code of silence rather than exposing the criminal conduct of their brethren, police in every region of the United States continue to unjustly target young black men as suspected criminals, kill them, and serve no prison time. And when they do serve prison time, they don't necessarily serve prison time, but sometimes the families will get a civil lawsuit going and they will win the civil case. They'll lose the criminal case, but will win the civil case. Those black cities that are already poor are paying those families for the death of their sons. So those are resources that could go to schools and to community parks and to improving the overall lives and bettering the community. And that money is going to those families because those officers are not insured at current, not usually, and they don't lose their pensions. The fact is, white police officers in America are rarely convicted of murdering young black men. And even to this day, right now, they're calling for Trump to pardon Derek Chauvin. They're calling for Trump to pardon Derek Chauvin. I don't know if it's going to happen, but that's what they're requesting. They're requesting that Trump issue a federal pardon for Derek Chauvin. Now, George Floyd was no hero. He had his problems, but he did not deserve to be murdered in the street like a dog and an animal. He didn't deserve to be murdered in the streets with his breath cut off, calling for his mother. He didn't deserve that. Nobody deserves that. But they are calling for him to issue a federal pardon, which some legal scholars say will not make a difference because he was convicted under state law. But if the president pardons him, then how hard is it for him to call the governor and ask the governor to issue a pardon for him, to set aside his conviction? John Henry says, they talk about black on black crime. The root of that is the violent culture of the American South that we inherited from Southern whites and that society. That is absolutely true. White women are the biggest raisers, and white women are the biggest contributors to mass killers in this country. White women are the biggest contributors to mass shooters in this country because most often it is a white male. They call it a lone wolf, but there is something wrong in their society that they are producing all of these mass shooters. The historian Stanley Elkins accused Black people of infantilism, being infant like. He ascribed it to the survival of a slave mentality. He was wrong. The American slavery experience, as horrifying as it was, did not permanently cripple Black people psychologically or turn them into a group of abnormally dependent children. Post Reconstruction, 20th century, and present day forms of white violence, repression, and racial discrimination have hindered and continue to impede Black social and economic advancement. Now remember, he was writing for a world where he thought that the people were ready to actually change. He was writing and he thought that because President Obama had been elected, that we were finally ready to face our racist past. But like a dog going back to its vomit, there was white backlash from them electing a Black president that seemed cool, made it look easy, got us out of the Great Recession of 2008, that did things for us. And they felt like they could hand it over to a billionaire because he would make them a billionaire. He would make America great again. He would take us back to our golden age. Well, every golden age that we've had in this country was the slow and steadily erosion of rights for Black people, whether it was during the Revolutionary War period, whether it was during the 1930s, whether it was during the 1940s, 50s, 60s. When you go back and you look at times when white people felt like they had power and control, Black people either had no rights or Black people had limited rights. And our rights are continually and steadily being eroded and taken away day by day by day. They want to vacate our cities and remove the social safety nets that we had in place, like a good government job or Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or, um, or the ability to be economically independent of them. And they want to take those things away, the education department, where our student loans are processed through, because we don't usually have generational wealth to finance going to school. We don't usually have a house that we can actually take the equity out of so that we can send somebody to college. And those of us that do have it usually don't have the ability to get our child to the point where they are financially secure enough with the little bit of equity that we can take out of our homes to go all 4 years of college. Okay. So we don't have that type of wealth to pass down to them so that we can send them to college so that they'll be okay. Because if we do take out a second mortgage or a home equity line of credit to send them to college, how are we going to pay the note? Most of us are living paycheck to paycheck in some way, shape, form, or fashion. We may not be poor, but the bills that are accumulating faster than we can work the hours to pay for them. So what's happening is we are in a cycle where we have to pay the rent or the mortgage this month or this week. Then the next week, the groceries go up. Then we need a new car. Then we got to fix the car, or car repairs come into play, or some medical bill comes up, or one thing after another, after another, after another. And we are just above subsistence living. even if you're making $100,000 a year, because now that you make $100,000 a year, you want to live in a better house. You want to live in a better neighborhood. You want to give your child better opportunities. You want them to live around different people. So you're making $100,000 a year, but you have $100,000 worth of debt that you're accruing. Epilogue. The author's purpose in writing this book was to reveal the full horrors of the antebellum era American slavery, allowing those courageous former slaves who actually suffered through it to tell us their stories. It was to expose facts about American slavery rarely found in most history books on the subject. The disturbing facts contained in this book probably give no comfort to the majority of Americans. Nonetheless, for the sake of fully educating the public about American slavery, the author felt compelled to offer his contributions to what is, in his opinion and view, an incomplete record of a dark period in our history. Inevitably, certain people will ask, why expose us to such a violent and horrific past? Others might ask, who really wants to read about American slavery? Still others will ask, are you looking for reparations? I believe that we should be educated about our country's shameful past to fully understand it. To understand and then acknowledge what the monopoly of violence white people in our country gained an insurmountable economic advantage over Black people by forcibly taking it and using up their labor and denying them the educational, economic, legal, social, and political rights and privileges white men in America enjoyed. But mine is not a demand for reparations. I demand reparations. I, the narrator, I, the reader, demand reparations. My feeling is one of ambivalence about that issue. Mine is a challenge to all to treat human beings fairly and alike in the important matters that affect their lives without consideration of race and color. Those matters include equal access to educational, employment, and housing opportunities, as well as fair and impartial justice. It is my wish that after having read this book, we will garner the courage and the resolve to plot a righteous course, to work toward establishing a truly race-neutral American society. Didn't I tell you he thought that we were going race-neutral, that we were going towards this multicultural America, that we were going towards this melting pot theory, not understanding white backlash after President Barack Obama had been elected? The author is fully cognizant of the fact that the present is not the past, today is not yesterday, and he is guardedly optimistic about the future of race relations in the United States. No doubt, attitudes about race in America have changed for the better over the last 30 years. The Civil Rights Act of the 1960s marked the beginning of a period devoted to the legal protection of the political, employment, housing, and public accommodation rights of all American citizens. Moreover, the children are in large part responsible and should be credited for some of the positive change in the racial attitudes in our country. Most are better able to understand the importance and to accept the moral imperative of racial equality and a fully inclusive society for all Americans. The end. John Henry says that violent culture can be traced back thousands of years to Britain, the Anglo-Scots and Irish that developed there over years and brought these to the United States. Exactly. They brought it to the United States. They are the violent ones because they were and something that we don't talk about is white people in class, because It goes race, class, gender. That's the pecking order. Okay. So a white male of any social class is better than a black person in this country, right? But among white people, they then look at their class structure. Okay, so a poor white man versus a wealthy white man, they are living two different lives, but that wealthy white man will employ that poor white man. And that's what happened on slave plantations. And they were often put in positions of power and control as the poor white man who had a different set of morals, who had a different idea about what it was to be in control, who was often more violent towards us. The rich white men were violent towards us, but when the poor white man got enough money to have his own slaves, he was just flat out brutal when it came to how he handled his slaves. There's a story of a slave breeder that told his female slaves he would set them free. He started out with 2 females and 1 male slave. And he told his female slaves, the first 2, that he would set them free after they successfully birthed 25 children. Okay? After they successfully gave birth to and nursed 25 children. And some black women actually did it with the hope of being free one day. There are stories of white lower class enslavers that got money, that whipped down to the bone black women and black men because they said no to the sexual advances, or they didn't understand the order that they were being given because this was not their native language. There are stories of enslavers that cut down and reduced the amount of foodstuffs that they gave their slaves and kept them at almost starvation levels just because it saved them a few dollars, just because it saved them some money. There are stories of white slavers that were of a certain class and just of a certain mindset that would lock their slaves in boxes that were barely big enough for them to fit in there. Do you know how expensive it must have been for them to create a custom box for a slave? How expensive it must have been for them to create a custom box for their slaves to sleep in and for them to lock us up at night because they didn't want us going about socializing with one another. There are stories of slave owners that would bring a man and a woman together, tell them they were married now, and expect them to reproduce more slaves. And then after the woman got pregnant, he would hire that man out to father other children for other slave owners. And we had to deal with that. There are stories of enslaved women giving birth to babies that are lily white, and that they could not and did not dare blame their master, their owner, for being the father of that child, because if they did, they could be killed. John Henry says the upper crust white folks told that to poor white folks to keep them under control, with them feeling better than blacks. Absolutely. Absolutely, they did. They absolutely did. I put the link in the chat if anyone would like to come up and have a discussion. But this is the history of who these people are. This is the history of what they have done. These are the things that they would like to hide. This is why they don't want certain ideas taught in schools. Because if you knew the horror of what these people actually did, if you listen to the narratives of the formerly enslaved people, you would know that these people are barely human. They've got to be barely human because only an animal, only a monster would do the things that they did. Only a monster would breed a brother to a sister, a human brother to a sister, would tell a mother and son to go have sex and make babies, would tell a father and daughter to go have sex and go make him babies for profit, would sell his own children on the auction block. Only a monster would do those things. Only a monster would impregnate you, get you pregnant with his child, a child that has his flesh and blood running through its veins, only to sell it away because his finances got messed up. He fell on financially hard times. So this is one that's got to go. Only a monster would do that. And we have to begin to look at these people and really understand them. We have to get to the point where we stop trying to make them sound like something that they aren't. They were not the benevolent, they were not the loving, benevolent people that they want us to believe that they were. It was not a patriarchal, kindly system. It was not. This was brutal. It was malevolent. It was evil. It wasn't just a training ground. It wasn't just an opportunity for Black people to become civilized. This was enslavement. This was a dehumanizing of you. This was a full exploitation of your body, whether it was for sexual purposes or if it was for financial purposes in taking your labor. There are stories of sharecroppers that at the end of every harvest, after having worked hard, they still owed the owner of the land because somehow the feed always went up in price during the season. John Henry, it says your device is not connected. I would love to talk to you. But it says your device is not connected. It says you have to you just need to connect your mic. You can leave your camera off. You just need to connect your mic. So go back out and come back in and try it again. Go back out and try it one more time. These people would have our children believe that they are not going to harm them when every chance they get, they harm our children, whether we send them to their schools to be taught by them unknowingly or because we have to go to a job and we hope that our child survives the day mentally and emotionally. But we cannot have our children around these people unsupervised because they pick on our children and they try to tear them down. They see the bright, brilliant light that is the Black equals African or African American child, and they try to quell it. They try to quench the light. It's a subconscious thing. You know, this author doesn't believe that we were impacted by the American slave system. I believe that we were impacted epigenetically by the slave system. I think that that's where our resilience comes from. I think that that's where our will to fight comes from. But I also think that white people were epigenetically changed through the slave system. I think that white women have been taught that their tears mean something, that their crying wolf is a powerful tool, and that the community will rally around them to save them. I believe that they were taught that their word was law. I believe that all white people believe that. And Donald Trump shows them that some white people are above the law. But they don't understand that if you're white and you're poor, you're just as bad as a Black person in their eyes. You're just as bad because you don't have value. And if you're Black and you're wealthy, you're on the same level of an average working class Black person. You're on the same level as the average working class Black person. It doesn't matter to them that you're rich, because the amount of money that you have to call yourself rich is nothing compared to them. It's what the average white middle class family has. Their dentists live around our celebrities. Their dentists live around our celebrities. Think about that. Now, being a dentist is a lucrative field, but their dentists live around our celebrities. And don't listen to the celebrity class for the most part. They should not be the spokespeople for us. They have different motives and they believe in the class divide. Most of them don't have the consciousness to understand that they're just working class people in the eyes of white women. I'm so glad you made it, Sister Raw. Thanks for tuning in. I'm happy that you're here. Thank you so much. I appreciate you and the elders with you. There was a gentleman named John Henry that was here in the chat that wanted to join the chat. He says he only has a chat on his PCP. He doesn't have a mic or a camera connection. He says that Black integrationists lied to Black children, saying they could not learn in this unless they were with white children in school, the BS doll test, and that Black children were better educated under segregation, being taught by Black teachers and white teachers from the North. And I agree with his sentiments. We were better off when we were segregated and separated. We had access to better resources. Our resources were different. We had the care and compassion, and teachers actually would go out and find information. And if we were to go back to a segregationist time or to a separatist time frame, we would probably fare better now because there are many educated Blacks that would actually make our children competitive. See, one of the things that I don't like about different programs that they have is that they talk about DEI and affirmative action, and they don't take the best and brightest. They just take a Black person. Because I have talked to older white people that were around when affirmative action was the order of the day, and they had to hire their token Blacks. And they said they would never take the Blacks that had the highest scores on the pre-employment test. They would take one of the ones that had medium or average scores on the test, maybe even one who scored a little bit lower on the scale, because it made it easier for them to fire them later and to make them feel inadequate and inept in their job. So even with affirmative action, they were working against us because they don't take someone who is adequately qualified and raise them up. They try to go to the bottom of our barrel and lift them up, putting them in a position they're not necessarily prepared for. And that's what white people are sometimes angry about. That's what we should be angry about. Condoleezza Rice was better educated than everyone in the Bush White House put together. Absolutely. She went to one of the best high schools in America at the time, a Black high school in Birmingham, Alabama. Absolutely. Sister Ross says, a new elder in the yard now, him not so well. Take much time and strength to deal with him. Seen. I see you, Sister Raw, and thank you for what you do. Thank you for getting them together. Thank you for helping the elders that are there with you. Thank you for showing your support and your love and your compassion. Thank you for putting them in a place, in a position where they can be comfortable and they can come together and they can listen and they can commune with you and with me and with all of us here. Thank you so much for what you do. I value you, Sister Raw. But Condoleezza Rice was not an affirmative action hire. She was just the most qualified person for the job. And what white people do is they take what they would do in their hearts, which is hire an unqualified person and put them in a position so that they felt inadequate. Okay. And they project that onto what everyone does. And our militant integrationist class didn't even tell us the whole story. Yeah, they talked about dogs being sick on us. They talked about different things happening to them. They talked about getting hit upside the head with a rock. But they didn't talk about the fact that they didn't just want to eat at a lunch counter. They wanted the right to gain access to some of the contracts that those white people had access to. They wanted the right to buy quality foods from vendors. They wanted the right to not be told to get up out of their seat. They wanted the right to do things and move about the world with choice and not look at signs that said no colors allowed or white only. They wanted that right. They wanted the right to be able to be hired. They wanted the right to be hired into a company as something more than just a janitor. Condoleezza Rice became the most foremost sociologist study of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Absolutely. Sovietologist during the Cold War. So she knew the Cold War and she understood things. The youngest of the elders here with her, soon to be 70 years young. That is amazing. the youngest of the elders with you are 70 years young. That is amazing, Sister Raw. I am so glad that you all came to listen today. Basically, this author felt that he was writing for a post-racial world. He did not calculate white backlash to be a thing because Barack Obama had been elected president and other states had prominent blacks that were getting into the office of governor. And he didn't realize that white backlash was going to be a thing, that after a Barack Obama, we would get a Donald Trump. And now we're living with a second Donald Trump term. So this author did not have that foresight. Well, I won't hold you much longer. John Henry, next time, if you listen on your phone, just so you know, if you listen on your phone, it's usually a lot easier if you have a cell phone to just click the button and come on in. I will be back here Monday, which is Monday, March 6th, 2025. We're reading The African Personality in America by Kobe Cambone. We're going to be talking about the African personality structure and basic traits. Now, last time we read Mr. Cambone's book, the last chapter talked a lot about the magic of melanin. The magic of melanin. And in the magic of melanin, he talks about how it has certain properties that basically put us at a level of a superhuman, because it has everything it needs to refine the human body. And in this upcoming chapter, it's going to talk about the African personality structure and its basic traits. So I thank each and every one of you for listening and for coming to listen with me tonight. I want to welcome John Henry. Thank you, Sister Raw. I know that Anthony McPhail is listening. I thank the elders that listen with Sister Raw. I know that Justin Liebert is listening. KW Don 7 is listening. Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. Oni Tase is listening. Justin Liebert is listening. The Forecast is listening, and so many others. John Henry said, simply explained, black don't crack. And that's to Sister Raw and the elders that listen with her, because we are resilient and we are beautiful. At 70 years old, they probably don't look much older than their 40s or 50s. And they are happy and healthy, living off the land, learning and loving one another, and being in a place and a position where they have a community. And that's what's important. I thank you for listening, and I will see you on Monday, guys. Peace.